our colleague Martin Brown, very fine archaeologist, very fine conflict archaeologist,
Yeah, yeah.
was
Cracking.
explaining how any of these sites were, they weren't built to a pattern. They were built to certain basic parameters, but within that, there's a huge amount of variation. And Helen
Mm.
just said, "Oh, just like Roman forts, then."
Yeah.
And so that the archaeological practice is absolutely transferable to this stuff, which is now just on the edge of living memory.
Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 28th of July 2025. I'm joined as ever by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman. How are things going, Andy?
Well, down here in southeast London, we've just had a clap of thunder. The start of the test match has been delayed, and basically the schools have just broken up. So basically, the English summer is in full swing.
And that, folks, is as close as you'll get to a truly sort of introspective, emotional response from an Englishman when asked how he is. He talks about the weather. It's a very British thing. However, regardless of what the weather does or does not do in the near future, we have a special little episode for you guys today. It's an interview. Well, the main part of it is an interview with Chris Kolonko, longtime friend of Archaeosoup and indeed Watching Brief, and a conflict archaeologist who has managed to get listed a series of very interesting little structures, which, we'll explore, I'm sure, during the course of this episode. But before that, is there anything that you'd like our viewer to keep an eye on, Andy?
In terms of general news, yeah, for a long time we've been talking about metal detecting and issues in metal detecting, and issues among with court cases involving metal detectorists. In fact, recently a well-known rally organizer, Jason Massey, was convicted of theft relating to a treasure find. And just last week, another leading metal detectorist and rally organizer, a man called Jason Price, who viewers of the Watching Brief might remember we talked about last year. We actually interviewed Mr. Price about some of the issues around metal detecting rallies. Mr. Price has been sent for trial, charged with seeding fines. Basically obtaining fines from elsewhere and then claiming to have found them at certain events, rallies and whatever. He's been sent for trial at Crown Court. The case will take place, there's a pleas hearing in a few weeks' time in the middle of August, so that's one to watch.
Okay. In other words, the latest in We Do It for the Love of History news.
I'm not making any comment. I'm very aware of the Contempt of Court Act 1981.
Yeah, I wasn't commenting on his case. I was commenting on
No, you weren't.
On so many instances like this. It's interesting how conversation around instances of malpractice or alleged malpractice often result in people using phrases like "bad apple." I've seen it actually very recently on social media. It's just a couple of bad apples. Why? Or one bad apple. Why are you tarring us all with the same brush? The problem is we've been doing this for so long, you and I, together, observing metal detectorists and metal detecting rallies, that if not there being more bad apples than not, there's certainly a problem with bad apples, and perhaps the barrel needs to be emptied out, and just something within the community or something possibly from without has to change, because just so hypothetically, in an alleged sense, what is the issue with seeding a field with fines from elsewhere?
Well, the allegation, and it's been made in other cases as well. And as I say, in Mr. Price's case, it's going to court. It'll be investigated fully, and we'll be able to comment much more fully when the case is concluded. But essentially, the issue is it's twofold. There have been allegations that fines that have been, to use the colloquial term, not one I ever use, but the term night hawking. It's used a lot in the popular media and the mainstream media
Stolen.
for Yes, exactly. It's theft. So fines that have been stolen by metal detectorists working illegally are then laundered through the system, either by being, quotes, found at rallies or found at other events, or even declared as found at rallies through the Portable Antiquities Scheme.
Right. Yeah.
To give them a fake provenance.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, that is both fraudulent activity, and it is also basically undermining the principle and the value of the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which is there to record fines on a publicly accessible database for the use of researchers. So if even a proportion of those fines are have been fraudulently entered, then the whole system comes under suspicion, which it doesn't help anybody, detectorists or scholars working with the material that detectorists declare.
This is where I often come back in my mind to Flinders Petrie's infamous quote about charnel houses of murdered evidence. This idea of shelves of pretty things from which we cannot gain any real knowledge or insight because we have no idea where they've come from. And in that sense, laundering items in that sort of way, if one does do that, is also essentially, to use Flinders' word, murdering the evidence. It is getting rid of, and not just laundering in a legal sense, but also laundering in terms of its, to use another archaeological phrase, its object biography. It loses its identity through that process. So, okay, this should be interesting to keep an eye on, and it's good to know about. Shall we dive into your wonderful conversation with Chris?
Yes. But before we do that, can I just do our usual appeal to our viewer to like, subscribe, and share Watching Brief through your social networks. If you want to support what we do, Marc has a Patreon where there are some really nice goodies on offer for subscribers, including the much sought after set of button badges for the Watching Brief if you subscribe to the Watching Brief. And I have a Ko-fi account as well, so either way, any support that you can give us would be hugely appreciated. We've got some interesting plans for shows coming up through the autumn in a sort of new season of a slightly rejigged Watching Briefs, and re-nuanced Watching Briefs. So if you want to help us bring that work forward and keep it free for you to watch whenever you want to on whatever platform you want to, like, subscribe, share, and support us on the Patreon and the Ko-fis if you can. Now, this is a conversation. Now, I have a huge respect for Chris's work, and not least
that sounds
because
like a butt is coming.
No. No, as I said to Chris at the beginning of our conversation, we're recording this in the second week of the Council for British Archaeology's Festival of Archaeology, where we celebrate all that's good about archaeology, so that's one of the reasons that it was such a happy coincidence that the announcement of the listing of the World War I pillboxes that Chris has been working on came this week, and he was able to make time to talk to us. Hello, and welcome to this Watching Brief special conversation with archaeologist Chris Kolonko-Weet, an old friend of the Watching Brief and of Archaeosoup, in fact. And we're talking to Chris today in connection with some research that he has done, which has led to a possibly rather significant listing. Now, on the Watching Brief, we often talk about things going wrong in archaeology. We talk about bad actors. We talk about issues with planning, where archaeology has been neglected. We talk about problems in higher education. We thought for a change, and because it's the Festival of Archaeology, the CPA's Festival of Archaeology, at the time we're recording this, it would be nice to talk about something where the system has actually worked more or less, give or take a bit, properly. And Chris has been at the centre of a story which was made public by Historic England today, in fact, as we're recording. And it's to do with the listing of some pillboxes in East Anglia. Now, Chris will tell us all about it in a moment. For those of you that don't know his work, Chris is a professional archaeologist. His day job is with one of our leading contracting units. But what we're going to talk about today is, I don't think he'll mind me calling, an enthusiasm bordering on a passion, bordering on, as he put it to me before we started recording, concrete bothering.
So professional specialism is the preferred term.
Yes. And it's to do, in fact, with something that's very close to my heart, as well as and in fact, it's in this connection I first came across Chris quite some time ago now, which we maybe touch on in the conversation. But that's the archaeology of modern conflict. It's a relatively new discipline in archaeology. Certainly, when I was getting into the sector 30 odd years ago, doing my masters and so on, it was really World War II, World War One were hardly spoken of as part of the archaeological record. 1995, we had the Council for British Archaeology Defence of Britain project, which began to raise the profile of the subject and recorded a lot of World War II, particularly material. But it was a pioneering but flawed project. There were lots of gaps in it, and now people like Chris are able to devote at least a good part of their careers to filling in some of those gaps and developing the work, the practice within the sector alongside organisations like the regulator Historic England. And to just kick off where we're going to start, the beginning of this conversation is actually a press release from Historic England, which was dropped this morning. And I'll just read you a little bit from it, and we'll take it from there. It said, First World War pillboxes in Norfolk listed. It says, 8 First World War pillboxes in Norfolk have been listed at Grade 2 by the Department for Culture, Media and Sport on the advice of Historic England. These concrete fortifications built along the River Ant and North Walsham and Dilham Canal between 1916 and 1918 form part of Britain's defence system against a potential German seaborne invasion on the vulnerable east coast. Then it goes on to describe the sites and issues and publishes some photographs as well. And then there's a quote from Tony Calladine, who's the East of England Regional Director for Historic England, and he's quoted as saying, quote, "The listing of these First World War pillboxes recognises their historic significance and exceptional durability. These ingenious structures were often hidden in plain sight and are a reminder of a time when determined communities prepared to defend Britain during the Great War, using the pillboxes and waterways to provide a barrier to invading enemy troops. They now form part of the historic Norfolk landscape and tell an important story of local and national significance." So that's what Historic England think you've been involved with, Chris. But there's a lot more to it than that. So how does this story start for you?
So, good question. So I kind of first came to Norfolk in, God, this is a long time now, 2012, I think it was. And by that time, I'd already had an interest in Second World War, pillboxes and all that for many years, probably for 10 years by that point. And it was when I came to Norfolk on a Council for British Archaeology, community archaeology training placement, which is a bit of a mouthful to say. It was then when I kind of like learned about these predecessors to the Second World War, so that there were potentially First World War defences in the area. There was a book by Chris Bird called, I think, Silent Sentinels or something like that, which I'd randomly picked up years before coming to Norfolk. And that made me aware of, First World War pillbox in the county. So it was part of the work I was doing over 10 years ago, where I was first able to get a look at some of these things and get an idea of what was going on in terms of comparison with what was being built in the Second World War. And it was kind of like, I got, because I'd done some work up around Sheringham, I think it was, and got to see at least one or two of these things. And it was quite interesting to see complete difference in construction from what we saw in the Second World War. So For those of you who don't know, in Norfolk, the First World War pillboxes are generally built from prefabricated concrete blocks, which is quite a specific method of construction that you don't tend to see in the Second World War, apart from in some prefabricated examples of pillboxes or examples where prefabricated concrete blocks are used for shuttering. And the Second World War pillbox in general, cast reinforced concrete, cast either in brick shuttering or timber shuttering. And this is where it kind of started, was applying some of the stuff I'd learned from the Second World War to the First World War stuff. And I think that's kind of where this listening application started. So not necessarily 10 years ago, it was more recent to that. But yeah, kind of like been able to see a clear difference in these structures from the First World War to the Second World War, and also starting to learn about the similarities in terms of anti-invasion defence during the Second World War and the First World War, because there are massive parallels in this idea of the threat of invasion to East Anglia, which everyone knows about the south coast in the Second World War. The threat to East Anglia, so Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex during the Second World War, was pretty much started at the outbreak of the Second World War, but goes overlooked in view of what was happening on the south coast. And again, we have these parallels in the First World War, where the east coast is seen as vulnerable from northern Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands. Pretty much from the outbreak of war. But yeah, that's what really sparked my interest, was coming to Norfolk 12, 13, 14 years ago.
And I think it's worth pointing out for our viewer that that you mentioned that the main invasion fear in the First World War was to the coast of East Anglia, and I think it's worth pointing out that that is actually very much a cultural thing even before the First World War. You have novels like Erskine Childers' Riddle of the Sands, about some British yachtsmen who go and visit the coast of Germany on holiday and discover the horrible Hun with their dreadful invasion plan, and they're about to descend on Norfolk and buy some chroma crabs, presumably. It was very much part of the cultural and mental mindset of people during World War One, that this was a very real, distinct possibility, not just the military.
Yeah, exactly. And and in kind of contrast with the Second World War, the threat of invasion during the First World War was reared its head from start to finish, so over the entire 4-year period. So obviously the outbreak of war, I should really know when the war was declared, but I don't.
August 1914.
Thank you. So in December 1914, we obviously had the bombardment of like East Coast towns, including Scarborough and Hartlepool and Whitby. And that really set the cogs whirling in terms of, wait, the East Coast is at threat here of potential invasion. And I know from evidence from work I've done in Scarborough in the First World War that shortly after the bombardment, barricades were erected in certain parts of Scarborough, because the fear was this was the prelude to an invasion, within a couple of months of the war. And we also see during the First World War this kind of like the constant ebb and flow of the Western Front, which often had this direct connection with how the UK was defended as well. With the German offensive, I think the last main offensive was in 1918, wasn't it? And you see this kind of like this increase of construction, kind of associated with these German pushes on the Western Front, which goes massively overlooked. London had a massive outer defences built in Kent, Essex, Norfolk, which were pretty much identical to the trench systems built on the Western Front. And again, this often goes overlooked. A lot of the trench systems found inland are often attributed to the practice trenches, when in reality a lot of those mirroring almost exactly what was on the Western Front are indeed part of a wider outer defensive network for London. But that's the kind of another kind of contrast again, kind of with the Second World War defence has not been seen as serious. The First World War defences nowadays are often dismissed as practice trenches,
But what you have discovered, and what Historic England have now listed as nationally important, is that they're very not practice structures, are they? They're very practical structures, as you point out in your listing application. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, that was the thing that quite surprised me, was the fact that when you go and look at these things, especially on the River Ant, sorry, excuse me, as as a military archaeologist, conflict archaeologist, you can clearly see that these things have been placed in the landscape to defend the given area, and they're also placed in the landscape in line with military doctrine at the time. So what you see with these pillboxes is they are sited on kind of like the crest of the high ground. So they are given a dominating view over the landscape, primarily to cover a series of river crossings over the River Ant and the North Walsham to Dilham Canal, or Dilham to North Walsham Canal. And their placement in the landscape is clearly for effect. It's not for show. It is there to defend this landscape effectively. And the one that I submitted the listing application for is kind of tucked away on a bend of a road, and you can clearly see this has been sited on to not only defend this road but also defend a nearby bridge and the approaches to the bridge as well. And again, if they were just sticking these things in for practice, they wouldn't. If they were, let's say, if they were practicing construction, as you know, the Royal Engineers tended to do, they wouldn't have necessarily stuck this pillbox in a location which would have, you know, been quite as confined as it was, because that hampered construction somewhat. But, you know, they would have probably just built this thing somewhere in the middle of nowhere just to show how to build a pillbox. But these things, and it's consistent across the entire grouping, they're clearly placed in the landscape with an intelligence and a clear defensive role, rather than for any practice purpose. You know, and even in practice trenches, when I've done work up in Sheffield on the practice trenches on the outskirts of Sheffield, we can clearly see that there's this thought of how to use the landscape, even in a practice landscape. But yeah, the pillboxes themselves are quite clearly defensively sited to defend the landscape using the military doctrine at the time.
So you recognise these features, and in fact one in particular, which I'm sure you're going to go on to tell us about in a moment. But at that point, or at what point did you decide that you were going to go and take this forward to a listing application? Because, and I'll say at this point, Chris has produced a video to go along with this particular announcement today from Historic England about the listing process and how you can engage with it in your own landscapes with your own important bits of archaeology which maybe haven't been recognised previously. We're going to link to it below the line, but if perhaps just for now, Chris,
Yeah.
what made you take this forward from a simple recording exercise to one where you thought, actually, this is important enough to try and do something formally with?
So yeah, that's a really, really good question. So I mentioned in the video how I went out with my mate Steve, who's a historian and has done a fair bit on the history of the defences of Norfolk. And the one pillbox that I submitted the listing application for, I had a good idea that it was unique. You know, people have written about it. It's popped up all over the internet loads of times. And I wanted to ideally go out and see whether it met the criteria for listing off the bat, you know. So it was prior to doing the site visit that I thought, right, if this thing meets basic criteria, you know, that might help it get listing, then I'll draw up a listing application. So I'd kind of preempted before even going out and surveying the thing that I wanted to get this thing listed based purely on its unique design. So it's, you know, it's a semicircular pillbox rather than the standard round, and that can be quite significant if you know what you're doing. So yeah, before even surveying this thing, I had a good idea that it was of potential national significance. And then upon visiting the site, you know, I did a very basic walkover survey. So took a look at the pillbox, looked at the landscape, took some measurements, made a quick sketch plan, took some photographs to archaeological standards to show the structure, show its main features, and show the landscape around it. And it was upon seeing this thing in the landscape that I was like, right, yeah, this is a unique design, but you've also got all this other information going on that is of additional significance to the structure. So the landscape context, the method of construction, the potential reasons why it was of this weird shape in comparison with the other examples in the county. And it was just seeing that I was like, right, yeah, there's a clear significance to this structure. You know, I thought this was unique in advance anyway, but I'm going to use this, use the field exercise that we did to inform my plan application. There was also at this point that I noticed the clear significance of not just this pillbox, but this pillbox within a group of pillboxes as well. And it was just, so before even going out, I had a good idea that this thing was listable, let's say, and it was, yeah, the field visit, the site visit that confirmed that to me. Yeah.
But we've not just got the one pillbox listed, we've got these others that are associated with. So how did that come about?
Mistake. So in the listing application that I put forward to Historic England, so I've made this available, the broad notes of my application online, because generally when things come out the other end of listing, you don't generally see the work up to this. You don't tend to see the application itself, which in a lot of cases, I've very rarely seen actual listing applications. So I thought in this case it was nice for people to actually see what I'd written, because there's a lot of I don't think you can actually find any examples of listing applications online off the top of my head, or especially relating to First and Second World War pillboxes. So yeah, when I did the application, I made it very, very clear in the application that I was submitting an application for this pillbox, but it also had this clear group value with the other ones, and I explicitly say, I think within the the opening paragraph of the application, this is one pillbox of several on this river and canal network of national significance based on their group value. And I was just submitting for one pillbox, and the idea was in my head that I was then going to go out, if this one was successful, I'd then go out and work on the other ones and do individual applications for those. So I'd not even thought about the fact that Historic England might just take what I'd said and go, right, okay, we'll list these other examples. So it wasn't my initial intention to get these things bulk listed. The intention was for me to go out, survey this one, see what's going on, and then submit applications for the other ones. And thankfully, Historic England saved me a lot of time by just picking up on this this statement that I made by just saying off the bat, these ones here are of national significance based on the group value. So it wasn't my intention to get them all listed. It was completely by accident on my part. But I was quite lucky in that Historic England saw the potential here and took the opportunity to do what's called a bulk listing project. And so it was completely by accident on my part. Historic England were clearly on the ball and knew what they were doing.
And perhaps we'll come back to that in a minute, actually, because I think there's a lot of certainly in some parts of the public realm, I think there are misconceptions about what Historic England does and whether actually Historic England even cares about this kind of stuff. I think we'll maybe come back to that later. But I mean, more specifically, you've described in your video how you went through the online application. You submit the application quite some time ago, and then you don't hear anything until a few weeks ago.
Yeah. So I've had that. So I've had one other successful listing application for. I mentioned this in the video as well. Special duties section sub outstation, which. Like a famous king appeared under a car park in 2012, and I submitted that in an application for that in 2012, and it was like 5 years for that one to come back. And by the time I'd completely forgotten, and then HE got in touch saying, "Oh yeah, we're doing this press release on this sub outstation that you've submitted." So that was 4 or 5 years for that one. And again, I submit these things and tend to forget apparently. But yeah, this application I submitted in March 2022. And I got the notification on the 8th of July that the application had been successful. And again, I'd completely forgotten about it this time. And as I mentioned in my video, I'd contacted relatively recently Norfolk Historic Environment Service to see whether they'd be interested in me, doing a bulk listing project on this pillbox. It came as a big surprise that I didn't have to. But yeah, it was, let's just say, just over, what were we on? 3 years, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3 years and 3 months was the process start to finish. I had heard from Historic England relatively quickly after submitting that they were interested in the application. And I think the main thing they were interested in was me providing information on the landowner. So a key part of the application process is Historic England knowing who the landowner is, so they can quickly identify a landowner and make contact. And in this case, during the application, it wasn't 100% clear who was the landowner, because it's a little spit of land that sits between the road and just a bit of wasteland, essentially near some houses. So we tried to identify a landowner, hadn't been possible, so I'd assumed that it was potentially council-owned land. I still don't know who owns the land. Historic England clearly found them. And then it was after trying to confirm who the landowner was with Historic England that I didn't hear anything for, let's say, 3 years. So it does take quite a long time, but this is one of the reasons why I always make sure that what I'm going to submit for listing is either not under immediate threat or is going to have some longevity to its existence, because you can't necessarily predict what's going to happen in an area, but if you can kind of preempt that something is still going to be there in a couple of years' time, then that's something to take into account during the listing process. Yeah, it's not an instant. You don't submit an application and the decision's instant. It does take a long time because there is a fair process to it.
And again, for people that aren't familiar with the listing process, and I know you're trying to demystify it for people by going so public with this particular story, and offer some lessons. But again, many people aren't aware that, or may not be aware that listing actually is a legal process, and if a building, a site is listed or scheduled, that then places statutory responsibilities on the landowner to make sure that it's not interfered with inappropriately and without planning permission or scheduled monument consent or listed building consent. So that's why that's important. And in fact, landowners can object to listing. They can apply for something called a certificate for immunity from listing. And you come across that particularly in towns, on sites that are scheduled for development. I dealt with a case a few years ago with the gasometer on the former Greenwich Peninsula, on Greenwich Peninsula, on former gasworks site there, where campaigners were trying to get it listed. It was the owner then applied for a certificate for immunity from listing, and in fact, it was subsequently demolished. So that's how this fit. What Chris is describing fits into the to the wider process. I mean, talking to the wider process now. You've got to the stage now that the press release has gone out. It's interesting that Historic England don't mention that this began as a public initiative, which, in terms of PR terms, as well as a bit of fairness to you in terms of kicking this off, some people might think is a little bit unfair, because this can, I think, and many people would argue, I'd certainly argue, should be a process where the public engages fully, and public engagement should be acknowledged fully, because it is about finding new important new sites within our public spaces, within our landscapes, around and about. You also mentioned that this site was well known, and you and I know because we're specialists in the field, but there's a lot of groups that operate in this sphere. Many of them publish online. They publish photographs on websites and so on. But up until you took the initiative of opening up that online form on the Historic England website, nobody had tried to get it listed before.
Not as far as I'm aware. No, and as I've already mentioned, this pillbox has been written about at least 20 years ago, has been unique. Over 20 years ago has been a unique design. It's appeared in at least 2 books that I'm aware of. The Historic Environment Record, so the HER record, mentions it's a unique design. And like I say, I've seen it posted many, many times about it being a unique design. But as far as I'm aware, no one has submitted a listing application for this pillbox until I did 3 years ago. So, I might be wrong that people might have submitted applications and they were turned down, but as far as I'm aware, no one in all this time, no one had bothered, no one had taken the initiative to do so, which is quite surprising given that this has been a well-known pillbox of a potentially unique design for such time as well. And I think that's what surprises me quite often with this stuff, is that the stuff that's out there that's known to be potentially unique, but no one's bothered doing anything with it. And it's one of the reasons why I'll tend to take a look at stuff in my local area and go, right, okay, well, this is clearly of significance. I'll just do it myself rather than wait for someone else to do it.
And I think it's worth drawing the lesson from this, that it is sort of we'll use it or lose it, isn't it? Or record it or lose it, because
record it or lose it.
And particularly if you mention the Historic Environment Record, absolutely critical to anything that could potentially be threatened by planning applications, for example. If something's not in the HER, it won't be flagged up in a desktop assessment unless somebody's really on the ball and wants to include absolutely everything and isn't trying to give the developer an easy ride in terms of archaeological conditions. Not that ever happens. And so, I think, I mean, you're a professional archaeologist, but this work you're doing because you care, basically, I think is fair to say.
I did this completely off my own back, and I've done this for it'll be 20 odd years now. Yeah, that's purely, I don't get paid to do any of this. I've built up my experience, by essentially teaching myself, because there's no archaeological um, manual out there of how to record a Second World War pillbox. No one's bothered to write that either, but apart from potentially in the future. And yeah, it's been a lot of like just taking the initiative with this stuff and doing it in my spare time, because I want to see this stuff considered properly, which it rarely is, especially from an archaeological perspective. Yeah, and it's also been quite a learning process in working out what meets the set criteria, what we can learn about this stuff, and making sure that information is put across in a way that's easy to understand for non-specialists and people who work in the wider sphere of archaeology as well.
Yeah. And let's share some experiences here. But what do you think professional archaeology needs to do to make sure that sites as important as the one you're describing here don't slip through the gaps in the provision, in the listing system, in the developer funded archaeology system, in the planning system, and particularly at the moment when the planning system's under a lot of pressure and under pressure to streamline. I mean, and I can give you an example from my own experience. I've been called up, for example, by Historic England on a number of occasions to ask about things that have cropped up, for example, in desktop studies around here, where they're saying, is this significant, or is it, whatever, and there is a role for knowledgeable people with local knowledge of this particular aspect of archaeology, isn't there?
Yeah, most certainly. Yeah, and straight off the bat, people with like my specialism are very few and far between. Very few and far between. And yeah, there are people, members of the public, who have like a fairly decent knowledge, but they don't necessarily have the understanding of the archaeological process and the planning process. So although they could have some kind of input into the archaeological side of things, they don't necessarily have the experience of, let's say, comparing and contrasting and making the case. So from my experience as well, I've also been consulted by Historic England about various bits and pieces to get my opinion on it based on my experience. And yeah, I think in terms of archaeology, there needs to be a lot more work going into making sure that people have the experience of First and Second World War structures, because in the discipline there are very, 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 as I'm sure you're aware, Andy, there are very few people with a specialist knowledge of these of this period, and that's not just in field archaeology; it's also in planning archaeology and all this stuff. And I think quite a big thing is this misunderstanding that every Second World War structure, I'm saying every Second World War structure just as a broad term, that every Second World War structure was built to a standardized design and therefore is identical. And this is what we see primarily with pillboxes. So from my experience, I've started recording local pillboxes that have been recorded on the HER to build up a detailed record of them. And a common thing that's popping up here is that pillboxes that were recorded in the let's say, I think 1996 is a common one around here, have all been recorded as a standard or common design. So I see it often, like every single pillbox has been recorded by someone as I think it's like a common Type 22, for example. So a Type 22 is a hexagonal pillbox. That's all it really means. But when you look at these things, and I've been going out and surveying them, every single one of them has been completely unique in terms of how it was built, and also its general design. It has very little resemblance to the Type 22 drawn up by the Directorate of Fortifications and Works. The only similarity has been that these pillboxes have been hexagonal, and that's literally it. So there needs to be a better understanding from an archaeological and planning perspective that although something might be recorded has been a common example, it's not until you actually look at these things and compare and contrast that you realise that they're not. And not every single Second World War structure is identical, even though in some cases they were built to standardised designs. That doesn't necessarily translate into what was actually built. So although something on the HER recorded as a Type 22 or Type 24, for example, when you go and look at it, you might realise that there's a massive variation, and a lot of this variation ties into location and who built it, and that is something that goes massively overlooked, and the listing process doesn't necessarily acknowledge this. as well. So there is a lot of catching up to do in terms of the archaeology discipline. And I think also this, the main thing is a lack of available publications that cover this. The only one that I can really recommend that does a good job of showing the archaeological and historical background to anti-invasion defences is Dobinson's report written in the 1990s. And that's literally it. So in terms of archaeology, we have a massive catching up to do. We have a lot of information that needs to be corrected, a lot of learning to be done, because, you know, even at a local area, looking at pillboxes within a 5 mile, 10 mile diameter of where I live, I'm seeing a massive variation in pillbox design, which you don't see across the border in Suffolk as well. It's that localized. And just getting that word out there that, you know, there's so much variation that we need to take this stuff seriously and start to reconsider and properly appraise and make sure that during planning applications there is an assessment done of any Second World War stuff that appears on site.
I mean, the analogy I always make is when, in fact, I sort of stole an idea almost from Helen Geek on the time team that we did back in 2007, where we were looking at a spigot mortar emplacement. Again, if you don't know what a spigot mortar is, Google it and the AI assistant will give you a rough idea. Then look up the proper sources. But we were digging a spigot mortar emplacement here on Shooters Hill, near where I live, and again, our colleague Martin Brown, very fine archaeologist, very fine conflict archaeologist, was explaining how any of these sites were, you know, they weren't built to a pattern. They were built to certain basic parameters, but within that there's a huge amount of variation. And Helen just said, "Oh, just like Roman forts, then."
Yeah.
And you know, so that the archaeological practice is absolutely transferable to this stuff, which is now just on the edge of living memory. But you know, we're beginning to understand the complexities and actually what we're losing in terms of historical record, historical knowledge, when it does go. So fortunately, you've managed to get these sites protected. Now, if there are things that professional archaeologists can learn from your experience and the field, there are. This is also an area where there are a lot of members of the public who are, when I say members of the public, people with often a great deal of knowledge, great deal of enthusiasm, but not always with archaeological training, are also very active because it's something people care about. But I know, and again, you've alluded to it in your video, you've had problems with some of those groups in the past in terms of, for want of a better word, the etiquette of how work gets done. Now, without naming names, obviously they're not here to defend themselves. But can you describe? It struck me. It's entitlement and gatekeeping seem to be words that seem to be in play for me when I look at you describe the kind of things that you've experienced. Certainly, in terms of who actually quote owns work and is acknowledged for having created work.
Yeah, very much so. So, you know, I'm all for sharing data because that's the whole point. You know, well, the whole reason sharing information is one of the whole reasons why I do what I do, is to inform the public, but also show what people can do to get involved in, you know, in a good way and help make a difference. But there is, kind of underlying current of, like, if I publish something online, I just know that someone is going to take my information and either try and pass it off as their own or not credit me as the person that did the work, which, you know, I spend a lot of time doing this, and I've spent a lot of time learning what I learn, and I obviously want to make sure that people can do similar things to me, or if not, you know, get to the same level as what I am. But I also want to make sure that I'm acknowledged for the work that I do and not have the work passed off as other people's work. You know, and that's something that happens quite a bit. So I just know that, you know, there's certain information that I can't release because it's either sensitive or it might lead to, you know, issues in the future, such as, I don't know, sites getting raided by thieves with metal detectors, for example. So I have to be really careful about what I put out there for this very reason, but also to make sure that, like I say, I don't not get credited for the work I've done. I'm just trying to think of some examples of that. So in the video I did in regards to the listing application. I mentioned in there that, I'm putting the listing application online because I want to show people what information is required, but there's also a fair bit of interpretation in that document, which is my observation. These are things that I've seen in the landscape and documented in the listing application, which no one else has noticed. And this is all stuff like quite detailed stuff, but no one else has, in all the years that this pillbox has been known, no one else has kind of noticed these things and interpreted the information in the way I have. And I can guarantee that a lot of that information will be repeated either verbatim or, in some very similar way. And like I say, it's my work and my observations. I'd at least like to get some credit for that, or at least be shown as the author and the person that's come up with these observations. And also kind of along that track, we also have, so I do a series of called like Pillbox myth busting on my website. And a lot of the myths on there have come about through this repetition of information from a source without acknowledging what the original source was. And what this has done is essentially create a series of myths because the original source hasn't been attributed. And then when you go back to the original source, it clearly states either this is my interpretation or this is based on an eyewitness testimony, which can be unreliable. But we see this like disarticulation of interpretation from an original source, which can lead to these issues of myths forming because it's not repeated that this is an interpretation or this is based on shaky evidence, let's say. And like I say, I think it's quite important to make sure that the original source is acknowledged and cited to stop this happening as well, alongside all the kind of the issues of gatekeeping and trying to take ownership of things which don't belong to other people.
On that issue, I mean, you mentioned eyewitness testimonies and so on, and that's something, obviously, given our experience in researching the Burma Spitfires project, that's something I've got a great deal of interest in, not to mention experience of looking at. But that leads me on to ask you so another question, really, which is that, I mean, certainly something we came across there, and I think you're sort of alluding to in this situation, certainly a great military historian Richard Holmes did in his book Tommy, where he's got a fabulous quote about the unreliability of eyewitness testimonies. He talks about by the 1970s, 1980s, First World War veterans are giving interviews and they're producing the whole war poet's experience. Trenches full of rats big as cats, and everybody died, and and that was a very partial and inaccurate view. It was a view. It was a cultural view, but you had what I mean. I've described again when I've been talking about this to colleagues as almost a sort of the myth and the cult of the veteran, and we're dealing with very particularly at the moment we live in times where national flags are becoming much more important to many people, including people who formerly would have eschewed that kind of overt national sentiment, rightly or wrongly. I'm not taking a view on it, but for example, you do hear that particularly people on the right now talk about wanting to do down British history, English history. The war is an embarrassment and shouldn't be talked about, and that somehow the authorities, including Historic England, and are allowing this archaeology to be destroyed, to disappear without it being recording or being preserved, because it's got to be preserved. Have you? What's your view on that kind of issue? Have you come across anything like that?
Oh God, all the time. So one of the reasons why I rarely interact on Facebook is because as soon as anything starts to be demolished, out they come, instantly, Historic England are demolishing our heritage and all this stuff. And this is generally from people who have had no interaction with the recording of any of this stuff or interaction with heritage organisations that ensure preservation. That's, for time and time again. And as we mentioned earlier, a lot of stuff is being lost because either it's not recorded on HERs or it's not adequately recorded. So, a lot of archaeological records relating to First and Second World War stuff are literally just a point in the map which says Second World War pillbox, and that's it, which in terms of the planning process, it does not show significance. It doesn't show the importance of this stuff. So that's the first stumbling block. A lot of this stuff has never been adequately recorded. And again, this kind of like ties into the wider issue of development affecting Second World War stuff, is because stuff's not adequately recorded, but also people haven't made their voice heard through the planning process or through organisations like their local HER or Historic England, when stuff is seen as significant. And I just generally see all the time, whenever something's been demolished, cries of, local council are taking backhanders to demolish this stuff. Which again, if you can prove that, go to the police. If rather than just going on Facebook and claiming this stuff. And like I say, I've seen people who should know a lot better as well say Historic England are deliberately destroying our heritage, when the biggest reason is because no one's bothered to do anything in 20-30 years. A lot of people have just sat and moaned on Facebook. And I see, like I said, I do see this a lot, and it's just quite concerning, really. And a lot of this could have been different if people had just gone through the correct channels, not sat and cried into the echo chamber online. It is massively worrying, but it's just a huge bloody conspiracy, and it also it's a way of like kind of hand wringing as well. So the people that often make these comments are the same people that have not done anything, so it kind of distances them from being a cause of this problem that we're seeing, because they've not engaged in any way, shape, or form. There was another point I was going to try and make, and it's just gone. It's also quite dangerous in people saying this stuff in terms of like, HE aren't interested, or local HRs have no interest, in that it also discourages other people from actually engaging with these organisations, which again has this circular effect of discouraging people with an interest from actually engaging, and it's self-perpetuating now. So people have been put off from attempting listing or recording stuff because they've been led to believe by people online that these organisations don't give a crap, and that's not true in the slightest, as we've seen with this list application. If you know what you're doing and you do an application for listing that meets the criteria, you can quite easily show that Historic England do care about this stuff, because otherwise they wouldn't have spent 3 years sorting this application out and listing eight pillboxes in Norfolk.
Absolutely. Although again, I think I point out for our viewers, and I wouldn't argue, I'm sure you wouldn't either, that the system is perfect, and there are pressure points for organisations, particularly organisations like Historic England, which has a very wide remit and increasingly diminishing resources. And so, which makes it, I think, all the more important to make that when people do engage, they do so from a position of knowledge and not expecting the staff at HE to do all the work, because they can't. And I think you're a case in point of doing it. One of the reasons we wanted to get you on to talk about this, as well as it's a fascinating project that you've been involved with here, and obviously a result that we're celebrating. But it is about engagement. It's about demystifying. It's about what I'm always calling talking human. It's not talking all the time about, if you're talking about heritage assets and significance and levels of harm, which is the one that I always find, even as a professional, difficult to deal with. What's a low level of harm, what's a medium level of harm to setting, and all the buzzwords that the consultants use when they're having these engagements across. I don't know about you, I've certainly watched planning committees where councillors have just said, what? Because there's this circular conversation can go on between the magic circle. So it's actually breaking out of that magic circle so that we can all join in the conversation.
Very much. And obviously I work in archaeology, so I know a lot of the terminology and know what kind of buzzwords to use where I need them, but there does need to be this breakdown of a reliance on, like I say, specific criteria, specific terms, and knowing specific terms, which then forces people to articulate their arguments in a different way. If people have a bit of flexibility in terms of how they're able or how they're required to get their point across, then I think that would certainly help. So in the video again, I was looking through the selection criteria for military structures, and I do think Historic England's guidance is extremely good. I think it's really well written and easy to understand. But you also have this underlying thing of needing to know how to structure your application. Which, like I say, I don't think there's very much guidance online about how to do that. Yes, you can go on the website and sign up and see what you need, the information you need to submit, and you have your listing selection criteria all laid out in these really nice documents. But there needs to be a kind of like bullet point guide or a video or something just to show how to write up your application, how to word it if there's any specific criteria that are needed, but also how to get started. And I think that's the kind of missing part, is you've got this nice guidance of what to do, and you've got the kind of like the portal online where you need to do it, but there's no kind of middle ground in explaining the process or demonstrating the process, which I think is something that needs to be worked on. Because, and I think this is where a lot of people fall down in not understanding or not having the information there to show that, if you just submit a one sentence which says it's from World War II and is important, that doesn't meet these criteria. It's not what's required. It doesn't, and I think that it's that kind of grey area which needs to be, let's call it fog of war, that needs to be broken down to show, like say, how to go from reading the listing application criteria to getting your point across in the terms that Historic England need to instantly see, right, okay, well, this is important because this and this meets this criteria, we can take this forward. And then that is something in terms of the heritage sector that does need to be worked. So it's not just Historic England either, it's other national organisations responsible that could for listing could do with putting a bit more time and effort into showing, rather than leaving the thing so ambiguous that people don't really have a clue about what to do to get their points across.
One last sort of issue I'd just like to ask you about, and it's something again I've certainly come across in my work with 20th century conflict archaeology, and that is that even if you go back to World War One, 3-4 generations back, there is still individual interest, individual family interest, local folklore, but often make these sites, if you actually just scratch the surface and look, they're very much a part of the local cultural life, folk memory, call it what you want. And I think sometimes as archaeologists, because we deal with the kind of systems that you've just been describing, because we deal with academic language and things like that, we find that quite difficult to engage with, and often actually don't engage with it, because also it takes effort. You have to find people, or when people find out about your project and send you an email or something like that, you have to respond to it and then maybe follow up and so on, and then you come across these amazing caches, for example, of family documents that can suddenly shed light on local installation, things that people should never have had, like diagrams of local defence lines from World War II that great granddad had as a member of the Home Guard and should never have taken home, but that kind of thing that's invaluable and doesn't appear in official records. Do you have any plans to look at these sites in those particular terms, or have you looked at any of the sites that you've looked at in those particular terms as well?
Oh, that's
turning the archaeology into history and historiography and folklore, even
history, and local memory and local people. To be honest, no, I've not thought that. My next plan was to start to look at the documentary records. So this will be records held in the National Archives in Kew. But I do think that would be a good approach. So one of the documents which I don't include in the in my listing application, because I know it'll get nicked, is a map that I was sent while I was working in Norfolk, and there was a digitisation project undertaken by the council, and someone came along with this map that they had in their possession, and it's the First World War map showing the area that I'm looking at, with all these points marked on it for the defences of Norfolk in the First World War, and no idea where that came from. I think it's a Royal Engineer map, but that came out from a local person. So this is not in a local archive or a national archive. So could have easily been missed without someone being aware. And I think that is something that I'd like to include more. These things, these pillboxes are over 100 years old now. And I think it would be useful to have these local stories attached to them, even if it's something like, I used to play in that as a kid, or I remember this when it had this feature which is no longer there, which is quite useful to know. So You know, kind of example of that is there's a pillbox in Dereham, which is down the road from me, and it's in a memorial garden to the Royal British Legion, and it's cracking pillbox, really really cool. I don't think it meets the criteria for listing, but I've done a lot of work on recording it. And one of the things that came out from conversation with local people was that it was renovated about 20 years ago. And part of that renovation process removed brickwork that was sealing the embrasures. And that's quite an interesting thing to know, because there was particularly once pillboxes had fallen out of use in early 1942 officially, there was quite a considerate effort going to denying these pillboxes to the enemy if invasion came. So what they'd often do is seal them up, seal the embrasures so they couldn't be used. And that detail, obviously, because this pillbox had been renovated and this blocking, the brickwork removed from the embrasures, was quite an important detail which hadn't been recorded anywhere else. It's not recorded in photographs. It's potentially in the documents, but I haven't found those yet. But it's an observation, this memory of that in the local area that would have gone missed otherwise. This pillbox was sealed at one point, potentially during the Second World War, and has since been opened up to show the embrasures as they are. And that little detail is really quite significant. So good thing the pillbox was renovated. I'm not going to say bad thing that it was unsealed, but it's good to know that this pillbox at one point was sealed, because that's a significant part of this pillbox's story and shows this. It visually demonstrates that, or physically demonstrates that, pillboxes eventually fell out of use and efforts were made to seal them. And again, without this local conversation, I'd never found that out, and it's a significant detail that can be recorded. So I think one of the things I want to look into, sorry, excuse me, in regards to, the pillboxes I've just got listed, is to look at these local stories and see if people remember features in the area that no longer survive and aren't recorded in any way, shape or form in the official records or in local archives and things like that. So I think local communication is vitally key. And there's another story with the Dereham pillbox as well. There's a chap who I've met through Twitter and Facebook, who's, I think it was his granddad, lived in the local area, joined the Royal Norfolk Regiment. And so he was originally from Dereham, joined the Royal Norfolk Regiment, was on home defence in the Second World War in this period where the Norfolks were deployed to defend East Anglia, and then lived in the area after the Second World War. So he had this kind of connection to this pillbox through his through service and through his personal life prior to and after the Second World War as well, which I think is just an amazing story. And again, something which would have gone completely missed if I hadn't had this contact with, people who live in the area. And it's stories like that which need to be, I think as archaeologists, we need to be more receptive to those. And generally we deal with physical buildings, and telling the story through physical remains, but having these personal localized stories is vitally key to showing how important these things are at a local level as well, and not just saying this is important because it's a pillbox, whatever, it's significant and a unique design. If we can get across it's significant to local people that have this connection through various stories and people who have been brought up around these things, is something that we need to work harder on in terms of recording themselves.
And you've sort of alluded to another of your projects there, Remember the Regulars.
Google
it, folks. It's really worth looking at, and we'll link to Chris's work in that respect as well. But that's probably for another day. For today, I think that's probably a really good point to end on, that archaeology isn't just about physical remains. It's about the cultural importance of this stuff as well. And the sensitivism, and the fact that we need to be sensitive about it. As Historic England have been here, they've gone through the process, they've been sensitive to the commentary, and thanks to your kickstart, we've now got more listed sites in Norfolk of a nationally important World War I stop line. Chris Kolonko-Weet, thank you very much for talking to the Watching Brief.
No problem. Cheers, Andy. Thank you for having us.
Far be it from me to suggest that when you get two archaeologists who love concrete in a room together, there's going to be a love-in. But you guys clearly had a good conversation then. It was nice to go into some of the issues and I suppose also some of the culture that surrounds these monuments, because they are in that sense landscape monuments. And I think the thing that I found interesting, and the thing that sort of pricked my ears, was this comparison to Roman forts, or indeed as we did after recording finished. We were sort of chatting back and forward on social media with Chris, and there was even an allusion to comparison with other famous British military frontiers. I mean, this is a fascinating comparison to make.
Yeah, it's one I've made before, and I know, as you say, we discussed with Chris after we finished recording. I argue that the World War I and World War II defence lines should be treated archaeologically. If we give them archaeological value, and we're now, this listing shows that Historic England believes they have archaeological value and group value, then we should treat them in the same way as we treat, say, a Roman limes like Hadrian's Wall or the Antonine Wall, or something like Offa's Dyke, where, as Chris made the point, these pillboxes often aren't identical.
No.
They're not built the same way. They're not built with the same materials. And in fact, in some cases, we know more about the garrisoning of Roman forts from foundation stones and Roman itineraries. Yeah, document. The Vindolanda letters being the case in point, which names various other stations and so on, and garrisons, and even individual personnel within those garrisons. We know more about that in some respects than we do about some of these World War I and World War II sites, not least because people who were involved with them signed the Official Secrets Act. There was the Defence of the Realm Act. People weren't supposed to talk about them. Many of the records were lost. And as Chris says as well, there are many myths about these places. Like, for example, they were used by the Home Guard. In fact, there is very little evidence for the and as Chris again asked us to point out, in some of the cases he looked at in Norfolk, there's very little evidence for the involvement of the Home Guard in many of these sites.
It's interesting. There's another analogy there, or parallel analogy there, where actually at Vindolanda, the documents which have been found weren't just waiting to be found. They had in fact been found at the bottom of a bonfire. They were essentially destroyed.
It was the Roman equivalent of shredding the office documents before you move offices.
And just so happens that the material at the bottom wasn't fully burned or didn't burn at all. And so actually there is a sort of interesting comparison there, whereby the Official Secrets Act, or just people contemporaneously not believing that this stuff is going to be of interest to people in the future. And yet, actually, obviously, it is, and can and should be. Do you think? I suppose it's just one sort of slight devil's advocate thing, in so much as Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine Wall to a certain extent, and Offa's Dyke to a certain extent, are all considered to be, at least in some capacity, active sort of boundaries. I'm using my words carefully there, in so much as Hadrian's Wall was not necessarily a violent place for most of its time in existence, but it was certainly a place where, for example, taxation could be monitored, traffic was certainly observed. It was a controlled area, and Offa's Dyke, there was lots of conversations around its usage over the course of its lifetime. Given that these were sort of, I suppose, almost preparatory works for a hypothetical defense line, and presumably in terms of planning, potentially a controlled retreat as well, do they compare favorably in that sense, as an important monument, given that they weren't used in so much as you could argue that Hadrian's Wall wasn't used in the way that lots of people imagine it to have been used, but it was nonetheless manned and stationed and monitored and documented at the time.
I think you can make various analogies, and none of them are exact. We don't deal with exact historical analogies at any point. There's always points of difference. And one of our jobs as archaeologists is to point up similarities, but also to point up difference and try and investigate the hows and the whys of the both. when it comes to the World War One and World War Two defence lines, obviously we're dealing with very specific historical periods. So these things are constructed within a matter of, in some cases, actually, in the case of World War Two defences, within a couple of years, and then they largely the anti-invasion stop lines go out of use because they're not needed anymore. A lot of the infrastructure remains, and then it takes on a cultural life. So, for example, pillboxes and so on became places where people would sneak off to get a bit of privacy with a boyfriend or a girlfriend.
Oh, okay.
It's they're there in popular culture. Like, kids would play in them. But they have many more uses than just the utilitarian use to which they were first put, and that's part of the story, and that's part of their cultural importance as well. But also, I think when you look at for example, Chris mentioned some of the defence lines, and the GHQ line, which defends London, that has an analogue in the First World War. Chris mentioned, and just down the road from me, on the very edge of London, just inside the M25, is something called the Vestendijk.
Okay.
Which is thought to be 5th century. It's thought to be a defensive line protecting what remained of Roman London, the territory of Roman London, from the nascent early medieval kingdom of Kent.
Oh, okay.
So, these things are part of a historical continuum, as well as being artifacts in their own right. And if we don't value them, a lot of this stuff has already been lost. A lot of it was demolished straight after the war. Even during the war, they'd already started to dismantle things like roadblocks and so on, because they were getting in the way of normal life as it resumed, as the threat of invasion receded. So, a lot of this material is already gone. And it's the equivalent, really, of the local farmer stripping out the walls at Bird Oswald to build dry stone walls on the farm. These and there comes a point when we, as a society, as archaeologists, as historians, as people involved with the historic environment, the decision was made to schedule the sites on Hadrian's Wall, eventually, as part of the local economy, turn it into a World Heritage Site, because it's seen as being of international importance, of universal value. Our colleagues in Belgium have been campaigning for years to have the Western Front in Belgium declared a World Heritage Site. So this is an ongoing debate. I think that there comes a point when we say, yes, this stuff has a value and we should recognise it now before too much more of it's gone.
I'll come back to that in just 1 second, because obviously I'm also very aware that a lot of this has been covered from Chris's perspective in the interview. So
Sure.
hopefully people at home don't think we're just repeating things here. But
No.
just on that note of recognition of monuments and this sort of thing, in that sense, there is a sort of a Stonehenge problem, isn't there, whereby people, when they think of prehistoric monuments, they use the analogy of Stonehenge. When people think of military or political frontiers, they use the analogy of the Great Wall of China or Hadrian's Wall, this kind of thing. And perhaps actually there's a lesson that could also and should also reflect back on prehistoric conversations as well, whereby actually not all frontiers look like Hadrian's Wall, and not all stone circles look like Stonehenge.
Precisely.
Yeah. But as you were saying, in terms of local interest and import, it is interesting, isn't it? How there seems to be a sort of a bit of cynicism that grows up around some of these structures, whereby people are convinced that perhaps they're not being taken as seriously or being held in as high a regard as they should be, in a sort of cultural sense. This idea of, oh, they're not respecting our heritage. They're trying to do down, decolonization, all this sort of stuff. I'm very much paraphrasing the stuff that you see, because some of it, frankly, isn't very pleasant. But do you think that this sort of decision, along the lines of, for example, the way that the Hadrian's Wall is recognised and so on and so forth, will hopefully help to dissipate that conversation, and I suppose more generalise the cultural ownership of these sorts of monuments? They won't just be the preserve of the local history nut or the local guy with a bulldog avatar on their Twitter profile, but rather actually they'll be a place where maybe the local primary school goes and has a look, and it becomes something which isn't just niche in that sense, for better or worse.
They already are taking on that role.
Yeah.
I mean, I've certainly done work with local primary schools where we talk about exactly that in terms of our local historical environment. We show them the monuments from World War II and World War One, as well as the Bronze Age burial mounds at the top of the hill just above where I'm sitting. So we treat the historical environment that those kids are growing up, and we're trying to help them to show them what's out there and understand.
But
it's part of a continuum. It's part of a story which they're a part of too.
But in that sense, of course, you do, because you're a conflict archaeologist, I suppose. In the same way that teachers across the country think of going to Stonehenge, perhaps if they can, do you think that this sort of these sorts of listings will hopefully help to encourage and, as I say, generalize that sense of these being landscape monuments that they can take a look at, they can consider in their work?
Oh, most certainly. I mean, a few years ago, I did a project with a colleague of mine, Rod Scott, who's another conflict archaeologist. And we did a project for Kent County Council whereby we wrote a leaflet about a village called Sarr in Kent, which was a self-guide. It was designed to be distributed through, the local post office, the local pub, whatever, for people who were visiting the village as tourists to the Isle of Thanet. And it was something, they could take the leaflet with them, go for a walk around the village after having lunch, and look at some of the surviving monuments. It happens to be a particularly interesting site from that point of view. It's what's called a nodal point. It was in 1940. It was designed to be a centre of defence for that part of Kent in the event of an invasion. It's just down the road from Manston Airport, in fact, and that's Airfield as was. Major RAF base. So that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of way that and Kent, in fact, we're very progressive in terms of looking at the opportunities these kind of sites provided early on. I mean, I know you've been talking about having a more extended conversation with Chris about this subject and about the potential use and misuse of this area of history, which all of us working in the field are very aware of. It's you mentioned the bulldog avatars and so on. Yes, it is very easy to take a particular viewpoint on this, which maybe isn't conducive to a shall we say more rounded view of our history. But I think as a sector, archaeologists are becoming more aware of it. We're certainly aware of the issues, but we're also aware of increasingly aware of the opportunities. I think it's an ongoing, like all archaeology, it's an ongoing conversation. And the position today will not be the position in 5, 10, 20 years time. Like I said, my career, such as it is, has basically encompassed the entire growth of the archaeology of modern conflict as a sector discipline. It wasn't really an issue when I first started in the sector.
No. Okay, and I suppose just to clarify for folks who aren't from the UK and maybe don't fully understand what we're talking about, I suppose just to be specific, what I hope comes out of this sort of initiative and ongoing conversations and more colleagues becoming more aware of what's accessible in their local area, and more people, more teachers, more members of the community being aware of this stuff, is that these sites cannot be used as sort of lightning rods for accusations of an attempt to formally forget the past. And nothing could be more difficult than to point at at a pillbox that's being visited by a primary school class, claiming, "See, no one knows it's there. No, they're trying to destroy our proud British heritage," when actually everyone's there looking at it and enjoying it, and so on and so forth. So I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes, and it's been great to see, obviously, Chris's work in this field over many years now, and long may it continue. And also, as you were alluding to there, I definitely encourage our colleagues to think similarly.
And Chris is doing it brilliantly and communicating it brilliantly.
He showed us things yesterday. Did he show us things?
Yeah, my precious document.
He did. Yeah.
No, in all seriousness, no. It's showing what Chris has done with this particular project, this particular journey to get those sites listed. It's in the round archaeology in the community, in the landscape. And I can't emphasize enough how important all those angles are. The research in the archive, the research on the ground, knowing what you're doing and what to look for in the first place, and then knowing how to communicate it and where to communicate it. I think that's the that's the big lesson, if you like, from all of this. And all credit to Chris, all credit to Historic England. The one thing I would just add, though, and it's to do with the comms element of it, and we alluded to it in the interview, and this is the last point I'm going to make today. But there have been some suggestions that it's sort of been slightly unfortunate that in most cases, certainly in the Historic England press release, they didn't say that the original initiative came from a member of the public, let alone Chris Kolonko-Weet. They didn't say that it came from that. It is, Historic England have advised the Secretary of State and so on and so on. Which is fine. They're bigging themselves up, and which is a sort of a little unfair when the initiative came from the work that Chris has done. And I've seen this happen elsewhere as well. And it's a lesson I learned some time ago, but it's basically that if you're an archaeologist and you're involved in a project and there's going to be a relationship with the media, at the very least, insist with the people who are handling media that you are involved in everything that goes out from them, and that you get a right to review and suggest, and ideally, I've been in a situation where I've actually written press releases for people, because
saying Andy Brockman is amazing.
No. It's making it's doing two things. Yes, it's about making sure credit's where it's due.
Yeah.
Particularly when you're involving members of the community, members who aren't, who are acting in a vocational way, not necessarily professionals. But absolutely, yes, credit where it's due. It's like acknowledging a purse comp in a paper.
But also crucially, I don't know if this is the point you're about to make, but journalists, whether because of deadlines or because of the fact that they're covering many different areas that aren't necessarily their absolute specialism, will appreciate help to understand how to describe what's actually happening.
Point.
Yeah,
that's exactly. But I've been lucky enough to work on a number of projects where I've been able to develop a relationship with the people who are covering it, including journalists. Partly perhaps because we can sort of talk the same language in understanding that you don't write a press release, you don't write a piece for a tabloid. in the way that you'd write an academic paper.
No.
That would just get consigned to the bin, and it would be rewritten by a sub-editor or a journalist who's got half a dozen other things on the go, and they've got to have so many articles per day and generate so many clicks on the website. We forget this. So and again, I have written for papers on occasion, and it is a very different discipline. You need to understand it. But I think if we're communicating archaeology, and again, particularly talking this week in the week of the Festival of Archaeology, archaeologists do need to learn how to talk outside of our own. And have the confidence to say, actually, we've got a really important message here, really good message here, really exciting message here that people will want to read, and we will help you get it right. But you've got to listen to us. I think on the note of how this particular story is being reported, I think Chris pointed out on social media earlier today that ITV News, unfortunately, they didn't say Historic England; they said English Heritage. Yes,
but also as well,
spot the difference, everyone. Yes,
but also as well, it was quoted as being a member of the public had initiated the listing, which is a shame because Chris is a qualified archaeologist and was working in
and one of the most experienced in the field in the country.
And again, I can't help but think that we could talk about this all day, but this is also a lesson that should have been learned around Stonehenge as well. Is that the people who through the people whose hands through which your words will pass need to understand why it is that you're including certain words, and where for them saying a member of the public might sound like a positive. It's accessible, it's understandable. People having their tea in the evening are going to be able to hear it and not go saying even local historian, if they don't want to say archaeologist, for reasons of comprehension, is crucial for just elevating the understanding as to what's happened and how it's happened. And again, just helping the public to come along with you on that story. So, important stuff. And as ever, it was a pleasure to see Chris on the channel. Thank you so much, everyone at home, for watching. Thank you for your time today, Andy, and also as well, thank you to Chris for his time. If you have any comments, please do comment below. Any news stories you'd like us to take a look at or cover, of course, reach out through the various ways in which we are accessible. And I suppose, as ever, until next time, do take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.